You might be a hodler, but if you know it's going to collapse, why wouldn't you exit it and just rebuy at 20 and save yourself a massive amount of loss?
In today's video, Chief Market Strategist of InTheMoneyStocks.com Gareth Soloway tells us all about his latest analysis of the charts as well as his predictions and price targets for Bitcoin and Ethereum. He believes that we could possibly see Bitcoin's low in the coming months. Soloway shares his opinion regarding high inflation rates, the stock market, the crypto market, and the Fed.
I was thinking about real estate earlier today, and I'm kind of saying to myself, okay, how do you come up with a bull case for real estate? Because if the economy stays healthy, then interest rates in theory are probably going to have to stay higher for longer, which makes it more expensive to buy a house. Now, granted, you're talking about 40-year mortgages, 80-year. I mean, if you do spread out the costs like that, it does bring the cost down, or the monthly payment. But then on the other side, I was thinking, okay, well, if the economy weakens, interest rates start coming down. We've even seen that here in the US. The 30-year has come in because expectations are for a weaker economy. But then if you have a weaker economy, people are losing their jobs. There's not as much job security. And so people would be a little bit more hesitant to buy homes, even with lower interest rates. So I was really, again, I didn't really contemplate the longer 40-year or 80-year type mortgages. But for me, I was having such a hard time figuring out how real estate starts to really gain and go up again, at least in the near term. So the one thing about my kind of recession call, and this is where I do differ with other bears, is like you have the Peter Schiffs of the world calling for like mega depressions and this and that.
They call it every year, don't they?
Right. But for me, it's not. I don't really see it being a recession that is very deep. It's more like kind of this dragging out, slower economy that it's not a collapse economy. It's like a small recession, but it just lasts for a really long time due to the fact that I see inflation staying slightly elevated and not allowing the Fed to come to the rescue. So it's kind of a weird scenario where I do actually see so you have the 100-year cycle. I don't know. I don't know how into cycles you are. But like with COVID, you had obviously the Spanish flu. Basically, it was almost a perfect 100-year cycle. And then late in the 20s, now you're coming into the Great Depression cycle as well. And so I think that's where you really get the big issues of the bigger collapse, like really where we could be in store for a depression type scenario. But yeah, at least my recession is more of like one that kind of puts you to sleep. It's not like you don't have 20% unemployment or 15 or 10% unemployment.
Might be like a shallow
you have like 7% unemployment, and things just are kind of crappy, but they're not horrible. What I'm envisioning is more like a scenario where you have this kind of, it's almost like the patient's on life support. So the patient's not dead yet, right? Dead would be depression, but the patient's being kept alive, but it's not really it's not a healthy condition. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from, where it's like, okay, we're alive, but we're not really living a good life here. It just kind of is what it is. And then eventually that next phase brings us to kind of the horrible part. But yeah, it's interesting. And then I look at the macro view just because it's fascinating and kind of gets me ready to make different plays at certain times. But I really try to exercise that discipline and patience, because again, like you're talking about with the recession, right? I mean, if it doesn't come, you don't want to start investing for a recession if it's actually not going to come for multiple years. You're going to miss out on a lot of gains in the opposite direction. So yeah, for me, it's much more short term, where I'm just trying to kind of hop in and I'm hopping out. For me, I've kind of gotten to that point where it's almost impossible for me to be a long-term investor, because there's too many cycles of up and down movement where, it's a good example would be Bitcoin. It's like Bitcoin's at 69,000. You might be a hodler, but if you know it's going to collapse, and I made that call that it was going to go to 20, why wouldn't you exit at 69 and just rebuy at 20 and save yourself a massive amount of loss in that scenario? A lot of people, and this is something I have my own views on, but the dollar, right? We've so many people will tell you the dollar's over. It's the great demise of the dollar. And from my perspective, I agree that eventually the dollar will not be the reserve currency, but I always find that people make it out like it's happening tomorrow. And this is really something that's a much, much longer thing, where it's almost untradeable in that respect, in that, you can't invest today for the dollar to not be the reserve currency tomorrow. The dollar is definitely hugging and what I have here, and I don't know if you can pop up my chart here, but basically much like you, so you have the higher low, you also have this longer term trend line right through here, and we've just been kind of hammering on it. So as of now, anyways, that's your support level. Now, what'll be interesting is to watch if we start trading up into this level. Do we break above it, or does it stall and eventually break to the downside? My guess is eventually it'll break to the downside, but I agree with you that short term, it's very decent odds that we'll have a push up. Way too much bearish sentiment on the dollar. Just like in reverse, you have way too much, for me at least, way too much bullish sentiment right now on Bitcoin. Doesn't mean that Bitcoin isn't going to go eventually higher, but the euphoria out there is definitely a red flashing light for me. But one of the things I'm watching very carefully is you basically have Bitcoin now just, number one, piercing the even numbers. So I'm not sure in trading how much you pay attention to even numbers, but I've found in trading that, number one, the retail investor puts stops at even numbers. So number one, generally those stops will get taken out because the algos will pierce them, which will then take out the short stop. And ultimately it gets max euphoria, right? When you see all of a sudden a 3 instead of a 2 in front of Bitcoin, 20,000s to 30, it just creates that like, oh, I got to get in now because here goes the run. And those usually denote short-term tops. But then also what I think is fascinating on Bitcoin is that you have so much former trading areas right in this 30,000 level, right? So if we look at the bull market from 2021, when it dumped out, this was the low. So psychologically, and you could see it right over here too, before it broke down, that was a huge, huge level. So it makes sense that right around 30,000, this is going to be a major psychological level for Bitcoin to try to get through. It doesn't mean it can't pierce it, like you said. I mean, it's already pierced 30,000. But for me, this is the big level to test whether or not can it get above this level, and then can it hold above this level. So yeah, it's interesting, really interesting to watch.
Would you say that's one of your invalidation points to the downside? Do you still think 15.5 will be broken?
Yeah, so this is my key level. So for me, if it were to get above this area here, let's say 30,500 is kind of that line in the sand, down sloping line, flat line. So if we were to stay above this for a certain amount of days and really start establishing it as a support level, then I think you have to say that the low is probably in, right? Based on that. Now, if we gets rejected here and we start breaking some of these technical supports, then I do think that things could get nasty very, very quickly, especially if we see the stock market take a big leg down, the risk off trade start to come back in. So to me, this is a huge level. For me, psychologically, like there's got to be so much. I mean, just think about this. Like, think about the people that bought Bitcoin here, and then they thought they were just, going to print money to 100,000 to beyond. And then they came back, they're like, okay, I'm break even. And all of a sudden they find themselves back in. So there's a lot of those people psychologically that'll say, okay, this is a level, I'm back to even after being down 50%. Let me exit the trade at this point. So it just creates a lot of resistance. So basically, at least for me on the charts, this was resistance right here around this 28,700 level, right? We kept on piercing it, and then finally we've moved it through it. So what's interesting is, and you know this from technical analysis, is when you break resistance, it now becomes support. So now on the way back down, let's say it gets rejected at this 30 and change level, this now becomes support. If it gets through there, then this level now becomes support. So there's a bunch of supports that were established because of all this sideways consolidation. So it's going to take a hefty sell to get us back through that. That's where things get more interesting. If we do get rejected and we get through this area, you then start trading towards the 25,000 level, and eventually you can retest some of these lower levels. I'm just kind of a step-by-step trader in that respect. And again, that's part of the shorter term mindset of what I do. It's just like, okay, that's been broken. Now you look for the next one. And if that one doesn't get broken, then you look and kind of focus on that.